When it comes to working with forms, we care about several things. First, the values of the individual form elements, and then the events caused by those form elements when you change them or when you move in and out of them. And of course, the event of the entire form itself, in particular, submitting the form. Now, if you've given your form and the fields inside it their own IDs, then you can, of course, use document.getElementById to retrieve either the form or any field in the form. And if the HTML for your form has either an ID or a name property is quite common with forms, you can use the following format too. Document.forms.name of the form. In this case, it was FRM contact. And if you use the name property in your HTML for your individual form elements, you can use that directly too. Document.forms.name of the form.name of the element. But I'm still a fan of the good old document.getElementById. So let's talk about the individual form elements first. Probably the most common one is the text field. And as we've seen in the events chapter, text fields have a value property. You can either get it or set it. And that's the same for a larger text area element if you're using those. Now we've seen the onFocus and onBlur events, that an element triggers onFocus when you go into it, onBlur when you leave it. Now onBlur is always called when you leave the element, even if you didn't change anything. So there's also an onChange event if that's more to your liking. But the text fields also generate events for each key press. In fact, 3 events. On key press, which is the entire press a key then release it, but there are also events for on key down and on key up, if you need to get that granular. Now when it comes to checkboxes and radio buttons, rather than the value property of a text field, which wouldn't really make sense here, what we care about is the checked property. That's the most important property of a checkbox element. And that's either going to be true or false. Checkboxes and radio buttons also generate an on-click event when they're clicked on and an on-change event. Most of the time you can use either or. What about when you have, say, a select field that contains many options, either showing as a drop-down list or as a list box itself that you can click in? Well, this can depend. See, in HTML, you can have a select that only allows one selection or a select that allows multiple. And you can actually read this from the type property of that element, which will either be select-1 or select-multiple. Now for a single select, when you select an option of that drop-down list, the onChange event is triggered. And you can find out which option is selected by reading the .selectedIndex property of that element. Having said that, but if you have multiple, that's not enough. What you'd then have to drill down to is the options array of that select field and actually go through all its options one by one and figure out if they have a selected Boolean property for each individual one. That sounds tedious, but it can really be done in only a few lines of code. But what about the form itself? Sounds like it would be more complex, but really it isn't. There's one main event of the form, which is the onSubmit event. This is called when the user clicks, not surprisingly, the submit button, whatever's been defined on the form as the submit button. Now, by subscribing to this onSubmit event, we can interrupt it before it actually gets sent to the server. You can check the values of the fields and even prevent the form from submitting by returning false from the event handler. So this is a great way we can improve the client's experience by instantly doing validation on their machine without waiting for a round trip to the server. Now, don't rely on purely JavaScript to validate any form you have. The assumption here is if you're submitting information to a server, you should always be performing validation on the server side too. But let's see a couple of examples of what we can do with this.